In today's lesson, I will show you how to graph inverse trigonometric functions. So the first step that we need to do is to determine the x values, which is the domain. Then we determine the range, which are the y values. Then we create a table of the x and the y values and we graph. In order to determine the domain and range of any inverse trigonometric function, we first have to remember the domain and range of the parent function. So for the arcsine parent function, so the domain for x goes from -1 to 1, okay? So -1 to 1. And the range goes from, so because this is the function, okay, this is the tip. So the range goes from -π/2 to π/2. So they are both included. And I want you to note the shape of the arcsine. So the shape of the arcsine is something like this. And then for this endpoint, we have the minimum value of the domain taking the minimum value of the range. So we have to pair this together. And for this second endpoint, we have the maximum value of the domain, which is 1 in this case, pairing with the maximum value of the range. So we need to remember that when we are graphing any other arcsine function. So for the example 1, we want to graph the arcsine of 3x. So we have y equals to arcsine of 3x. So what we want to do is to now determine what is the domain. So we remember that the domain for the arcsine goes from -1 to 1. But now, in this case, instead of just dealing with x, we are dealing with 3x. So we need to divide this by 3 to be able to have x only in the middle of this inequality. So this 3 goes in this 3, 1. So we are now have -1/3 less than x less than or equals to 1/3. So we now know that x values goes from -1/3 to +1/3. And the midpoint for that is going to be 0. What about the range? So in this particular function that we are given, we know that the value of y didn't change. So the y remains as from -π/2 to π/2. So we are just going to put that in there. So now we can grab the table. Okay, so we grab this table. So -1/3 is -0.3333. So it's just going to be a little bit above -0.3. Okay, so we can say this is the point there. And 0, 0, that's the point. And then for π/2 and +1/3, so it's going to be there. And we remember that the arcsine graph looks like that. So we are just going to do a freehand sketch. This is not going to be perfect. The graph of arcsine of 3x looks like that. For example 2, we are given this function. So we want only this arcsine to be on the right. So we are going to have y minus pi equals to arcsine half x minus 1. The domain for this still goes from -1 to 1. But now, instead of dealing with x, we are dealing with half x minus 1. So we want to simplify this inequality so that the only thing that we have in the middle will be x. So the first thing that we have to do is to add 1 across the inequality. So if I add 1 to -1, I'm going to get 0. Then I need to multiply the inequality by 2 across so that I can remove this half that is in the middle. So 2 multiplied by 0 is still going to be 0. 2 multiplied by half will now be 1, so we only have x. And 2 multiplied by 2 will be 4. So our x value goes from 0 to 4. And the midpoint is 2. So the range goes from -π/2 to π/2. But instead of dealing now with ordinary y, we are dealing with y minus pi. Okay, So we want to simplify this inequality too, so that only y is in the middle. So I just have to add pi across the inequality. So negative pi over 2 plus pi is just going to be positive pi over 2. And pi over 2 plus pi will be 3 pi over 2. Okay, so pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2. So the midpoint between half a pi and 1.5 pi is going to be pi. Okay, so I can now graph this. So 0 takes pi over 2, and 2 takes pi, and 4 takes 3 pi over 2. Okay, so that graph is going to look something like that. So for the arc cosine, we need to define the domain and range so that we know what to use when we are graphing the arc cosine. So the domain for the arc cosine still goes from -1 to 1. Okay, so it's -1 to 1. And the range now goes from 0. So this is the minimum value, and the maximum value is this point. So it goes from 0 to pi. So what I want you to notice in this arc cosine graph is that for this point, the minimum value of the domain pairs with the maximum value of the range. So you pair these two together, okay? And for this endpoint, we are pairing the maximum value of the domain, which is this one, to the minimum value of the range. So you pair these two together, okay? And the graph is something like this. As a first example, we want to graph this arc cosine of x minus 2. The domain also goes from -1 to 1, but now instead of dealing with x, we are dealing with x minus 2. Okay, so I need to add 2 across this inequality to be able to simplify the middle of it to x. So -1 plus 2 is just going to be +1. X minus 2 plus 2 is just going to be x, and 1 plus 2 is going to be 3. So we know that now that our x goes from 1 to 3, and then the midpoint will be 2. So since the y didn't change, so we have the range going from still 0 to pi, okay, 0 to pi. But you remember that we have to switch the minimum value of the domain takes the maximum value of the uh, range, and then the maximum value of the range will goes to the minimum value of the domain. So, and the midpoint between 0 and pi is pi over 2. Okay, so I can now grab this. So when I have 1, I have pi. Okay, when I have 2, I have pi over 2. And when I have 3, I have 0. So, and you remember that the graph of arc cosine is like this. So I'm just going to sketch. And it's something like that. Okay. For the example number 4, we are asked to graph this. We need to first simplify this function before we graph. This pi over 4, we need to move it. It's going to become positive on that side. Pi over 4 equals to half arc cosine of x plus 1. Okay, so I need to remove this half by multiplying both sides by 2. Okay, so when you are multiplying two things, please remember to use the parentheses. So I'm multiplying this left side by 2. Okay, so 2 multiplied by half will be 1. So all I'm left with on the right is arc cosine of x plus 1. So now that we've separated the x and the y, so we can find the domain. So the domain is still going from -1 to 1, but now we are dealing with x plus 1. Okay, so I need to subtract 1 across this inequality to be able to simplify the middle of the inequality to x. So if I subtract 1, this will become -2, and 1 minus 1 becomes 0. So for the x, I have -2. 0, and the midpoint between 0 and -2 is -1. So the range for the arc cosine goes from 0 to pi. But now, instead of dealing with y, we are dealing with 2y plus pi over 4. Okay. So I need to simplify. So the first thing is we need to divide by 2 across the inequality. So 2 goes into one time. So 0 divided by 2 is still 0. Okay. Y plus pi over 4. So I need to now subtract pi over 4 across this inequality to be able to reduce the middle of it to y. So 0 minus pi over 4, so that becomes negative pi over 4. And pi over 2 minus pi over 4 is going to become positive pi over 4. Okay. So, and we remember for the arc cosine, the minimum domain takes the maximum range. So this is going to be pi over 4, then negative pi over 4. Okay, so the midpoint between positive pi over 4 and negative pi over 4 is going to be 0. So I can now graph. So when it is negative 2, it is positive pi over 4. When it is negative 1, is 0. And when it is negative, when x is 0, it is negative pi over 4. So, and again, you remember that the shape of the arc cosine is something like this. So thank you so much. Please remember to subscribe.